Welcome to the latest episode in Leadership and Culture in Healthcare. I'm Matthew Winn, the podcast host, and this week I am with Hal Spencer from Chesterfield. Hal, do you want to introduce yourself and tell everybody a little bit about your organisation?
So my name's Hal Spencer. I'm a doctor by background, and I've been at Chesterfield Royal Hospital, which is an acute sort of small, medium-sized trust, so district general hospital, if you'd like, within strictly within the East Midlands, but actually on the South Yorkshire border. So we kind of link both into the East Midlands and into South Yorkshire, which is where lots of our pathways go. I first came to Chesterfield Royal Hospital as a medical registrar back in 2003. And I liked it so much as a place that a year later, when I was applying for consultant jobs, I applied and was successfully appointed as a consultant in 2004. So I've been here for over 20 years, but the vast majority of my time here as a doctor rather than as a manager. In more recent times, I was medical director from 2019 and then became chief exec in 2022. I started on April Fool's Day, which always seems kind of an appropriate day for chief executives to start. And I always thought when I was appointed, it was kind of in a way I'd had one of the longest interviews of all time, because in many ways, I think I'd be being judged on what I'd done over a very large number of years rather than just, which is the case for other internal candidates always in that situation, isn't it? But I think it's suppose if over the years people hadn't been happy with my behaviours or performance or whatever, then you'd have never been on the starting line for the post.
Indeed. And how? What speciality are you, or were you a consultant?
So I'm a gastroenterologist.
Okay.
One of the things that I still do, which I guess is probably relatively unusual for chief executives, is I still do one clinical session a week. So on a Thursday morning, I alternate between doing a gastroenterology clinic and doing an endoscopy list, which I think is good for me because sometimes doing something a bit different keeps us motivated and interested. But it's also, I think it probably is not a bad thing from the organisation's point of view, because I think there's sometimes a bit of a tendency, isn't there, for our staff to think, oh, the manager's up there, they don't really know what it's like, they're not really in touch with what's going on, they're in their ivory towers. And actually doing that clinical session, it's very much a kind of obvious manifestation of the fact that we are involved on the day-to-day working of the hospital and still do have the kind of patient at the heart of what we're thinking about.
And how we're having this conversation because in this series we're talking to chief executives of organizations whose staff survey results, their staff have said they're doing really well. And when I look at your staff survey results, everything's over average, and flexibility, always learning, stand out as best in class for your type of organization. And that's the same for 22, 23 as is 23, 24. Talk me through what you and the organization are proud of in terms of the things that you've done around supporting your staff.
One thing I think we're all proud of is kind of where we've come from, because 10 years ago kind of thing, we started out on the journey and our staff survey results weren't good. And whilst we had a kind of, in lots of ways, very friendly place that we were all working in, our staff as a group felt disengaged. They felt they weren't listened to, that their views didn't matter. And so we did consciously as a board, and some of this is before my time, but I was kind of conscious of it, set out to try to engage our staff and make them so that they appreciated that actually what they thought was really important. And if we're a hospital and we're all about giving good care to our patients, that the only way we can really do that is by having well-engaged, motivated staff who are wanting to do the right thing. And if our staff weren't feeling that it was a good place to work, and that caused both practical, recruitment problems, but also people who weren't really bothered to do the right thing because they didn't feel listened to, then that was going to have a really bad impact on the care we gave to patients. And I think so one way I suppose I'd express that is that my two key objectives are around it being a good place to work and about it being an organisation where our staff would think that they would be happy with the care that, you know, if their relative or friend came into hospital. And I think those two are completely linked. I don't think that, you know, you can't do one without doing the other. So if we want to give excellent care to patients, we do need to have excellent staff who feel believed in and feel valued. So we set off as a kind of conscious thing, and we did it at the very beginning through this program, which you may have come across in the past, called Leadership into, is it Leadership into Action? It's called, but it was one of the, you know, sort of improvement methodologies. But fundamentally, it was about going out to all of our staff and saying, well, you know, what do you think? You know, what could we do better?
Oh, and how was there a catalyst at that time? So you said the staff survey results were bad, but my guess is they might have been bad for a while. But so what made it important to do it at that time and make the change?
So I think it was the catalyst was having a new chair who came from the commercial sector, but had a very strong belief in the staff being the kind of greatest asset of the organisation, and that our staff at the time clearly weren't happy based on a whole range of metrics, but including the National Staff Survey. And we wanted to do something better about it if we wanted to improve the care for our patients. So that was the catalyst. What's definitely the case is that change didn't happen overnight. It was probably 3 years before there was a significant upswing in outcomes, like on the staff survey. Like anything like that, things happen gradually, don't they? They don't. You don't put in a new person, suddenly everything's better overnight. And then we kind of, like probably lots of organisations, lost our way a bit during COVID because we were also focused on COVID. But then since then, have had a kind of renewed focus on it, because ultimately I think principles behind it are something that are very dear to me as well, and I think are very important.
And when you've just used the kind of expression we did it, we just help our listeners to the podcast understand what does that mean? If you were to kind of summarize what Chesterfield Royal does with its staff, how unpack that a bit for us.
So I think that's really difficult, because I think there's all sorts of things that all of us as organisations do, and knowing which bits are the ones that really make a difference is hard sometimes, isn't it? I mean, I think I guess at the heart of it, it's about trying to engage lots of people, and I guess that takes all sorts of different forms, doesn't it? You know, if we're, for the sake of argument, if we were wanting to know about how we were going to improve a clinical pathway to either help patients or to current day save money, we'd start by trying to involve the clinicians in it. And by clinicians, I'm talking about in the widest sense. So I've not got a medic-centric view about that. It would be, you know, it might be allied health professionals, or it might be the doctors, or it might be the nurses. But it's sort of saying to them, well, you know, what is it that's not working well at the moment? Where are we doing our patients a disservice at the moment? What could we do better? And then we've got a kind of internal improvement academy. We'll work with the teams to try and, you know, at the beginning you might be having a sort of workshop, and you garnering lots of different ideas, and then you're taking that back and saying, well, you know, this is doable, this isn't doable, and it's feeding back along the way. Because I think one of the things that's really important with all of this is that it's not just about listening, but it's kind of about hearing and acting as well. Because it's really easy, isn't it, to sort of say, oh, you know, tell us all about it. But then if we don't kind of pay attention to what's being said, or if we don't do something about what's being said, people rapidly lose any faith in it, and we lose all credibility, we lose our authenticity if we do that. So we do need to do it. I think there's a whole range of things, you know. So for example, I monthly session, which we call Ask Hal, but it's on Teams, and it's open to anyone in the hospital. and I'm there to be kind of shot at. And sometimes people ask questions in advance, sometimes people ask questions on the day, and I don't always know the answer to it. And sometimes the answer is, I don't know, I'm going to have to come back to you about it. But the really important bit is that I do go back to people about it, so, and however, half the time it's about things like car parking issues or but they're,
I was about to say car parking, coffee, refreshments, but really, things that get in the way, don't they, all the time?
they're the things that are actually, there's the big things, but the little things are important to our staff as well. And I think if we kind of ignore them, we do so at our peril. And if we kind of pretend it doesn't matter, or we hear and say, oh yeah, it'll be sorted, but nothing ever happens, people lose face. So I really do try to follow up on issues that are raised, and I do try to, sort of individually, as we have, methods of sharing wider answers, but also to the individuals as well. Because I think in the end, sort of individuals feeling valued is a really good thing. There's another, sorry if I'm rambling, but there's another little example. We in lots of organisations, we obviously get complaints and concerns, but we also get lots of compliments from people. And we didn't have a mechanism really of sharing. And within the compliments, sometimes it'll be about a department, but sometimes an individual person will be named as well. So whenever that happens, I've got a mechanism where all of those compliments are, I'm copied into the compliment, but I make a point of individually contacting the person who's named in the compliment to say, thank you, well done, it's appreciated, it makes a difference. And, over, of course, I'm not going to be, the 5,000 employees we have are not all going to get a compliment at some point, but I think there's something about the messaging and the way that lands and people feeling appreciated for when they are doing a good job. And hopefully that then has a bit of a knock-on effect to how other people behave and how they think of the organisation, where they're getting credit when they've done something that's good, but it's being recognised by us as leaders as opposed to, sort of getting lost somewhere.
And doing that consistently from you as a leader, I guess, is quite time consuming, because you'll get a lot of compliments. I mean, it's either a card or it's an email or it's a face-to-face thank you. And it sounds like you prioritize that to say, look, this is important, I will always do it.
Yeah, and it is time consuming because, all things are relative, aren't they? But, it probably does take me an hour or two a week doing that, but I kind of think that's an important thing to do, because I've always been a sort of believer in that, carrots are better than sticks for keeping a workforce motivated in the long term. And you can, in the short term, you can try and beat people up a bit about things, but actually that's never going to work as a, over a big organisation and over a long time period. People have to feel bought into it and motivated themselves to make a difference. And I'd emphasise, all of this. It's absolutely a team thing, isn't it? However effective we might like to think, we are or aren't as individuals, you've got to do it with all of the people behind you. As an example, I always used to think, some years ago when I was divisional director for medicine and emergency care, which was like our kind of, one of our main, sort of groups. But the thing that made me effective as divisional director was having a really good general manager. That, and I used to, sometimes when I had interviews, I used to say that, because actually things don't work if you're just trying to do it in isolation. It can only work if you're working together as a team, and that team, feels valued and appreciated, because why do they keep going above and beyond if, they don't get any credit for it? So I think that's sort of really important. I think that's a really important ethos for the whole hospital. Why do people work longer hours than they ought to for nothing? Why do people go above and beyond for patients? Part of it's because, we're good and well motivated in the NHS, but we're all human as well, and we all like some recognition and acknowledgement that we're doing that.
And how that's an interesting element, isn't it, of creating that culture? Because lots is written about culture in organizations, but you've just described supporting people, recognizing people, and recognizing what they're doing above and beyond. So how do you, with 5,000 staff, it's a big operation. How do you ensure that happens consistently with all of your leaders? How do you get that leadership culture that's everywhere? And I'm sure you're going to tell me it's not present everywhere, because no one can say it is everywhere. I say that in my organization, but how do you do it then?
So you're absolutely right. It isn't present everywhere. And, if some of my staff were listening to this in a while, they'd be saying, oh, still talking rubbish.
Yeah,
it's
all right for you to say that. Yeah.
So I'm very, I recognise that. I think it has to be a sort of leading by example. I don't think it's about. I think there's a kind of kind but fair bit about this, isn't there? You have to do things in the right way, and you have to be respectful and considerate to people. But that isn't about agreeing to everything everyone wants all of the time. You can't do that. But I think there's a sort of as a clinician, there's a group called Civility Saves Lives, and it's came out of emergency departments in Birmingham. But it's all about how if you've got a team working together and people are kindly and respectful to each other and listen to each other's opinions, you're much more likely to get a good clinical outcome at the end of it. And I think it's, in a way it's obvious, isn't it? Because if people are scared to speak up because they're worried they're going to get their head bitten off, or they're going to be, marked or put down, they're not going to speak up. And then when there's an issue that's apparent to them but everyone else is missing, that they'll feel intimidated and won't speak up, and so your outcomes are worse at the end of it. And that's very obvious in a clinical situation in an emergency department. But actually, I think that can be extrapolated to virtually everything we do. And for example, I think we've got a really good freedom to speak up kind of process and encouragement around that. And I'll myself repeatedly say, I do want people to raise things. People do sometimes raise things directly to me as well as to the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian. But it's then about, I think it has to be about what we do about when things are raised to us and that we actually act upon it. But I think that culture then hopefully filters down into the organisation, that if I'm listening to when people are raising concerns, other people kind of take a lead from that. And if, for the sake of argument, if I'm in a meeting and someone, starts talking in acronyms and I don't know what the acronym stands for, I absolutely am happy to put my hand up and say, can you please explain it? And I think that kind of intelligent inquiry and openness to, acknowledging we don't know everything, but that we can learn, hopefully gives an environment where other people feel comfortable doing that as well. And then that's it. One of the staff survey questions about being a learning organisation that we score highly in, hopefully, is that kind of process. We're not trying to pretend that we know things if we don't know, and we're not trying to, if there's a patient safety incident, we're not trying to cover it up. We're trying to say, well, actually, we did get things wrong there. We are going to acknowledge that, but we're also going to try and learn from it and do something better, rather than pretend it didn't happen because it all looks a bit bad and we don't want to talk about it.
So I'm getting the impression there's a kind of almost a ripple effect. So there's, good behavior then spreads good behavior, and people see what's recognizable as acceptable or not, which is a really great way to do things, which must be with you and your exec directors and non-execs, etc. There must be some systemic things that you do as well. So I've heard, you've talked about Civility Saves Lives, and I think I heard earlier you talk about your QI, your Leadership Academy, was it? So those sound like purposeful interventions to try and elicit a different reaction. Is that kind of, were they planned kind of ongoing ways to kind of shape the culture of the organisation?
I think it's a bit of both, isn't there? We obviously do, talk, within our board and at our exec team and leadership, we've got a leadership assembly, and we do talk about the kind of strategy of it, if you'd like, but it's also something that it's a softer thing as well, isn't it? Not everything can be written down on paper in a policy or an SOP or something. Some of it is about how we do behave on a day-to-day basis. And if and I hope my colleagues at work would think I was being honest about this, but if I was in a meeting and I was preaching about being good behaviours and respecting people, and at the same time half an hour later I'm biting someone's head off in the meeting, then there's no reality in that. So I think it only works if you're practicing what you're preaching, and that people consider it, consider you to be authentic within that. It has to be, we have to act in the way we're talking about, otherwise it definitely doesn't work.
Yeah, consistency and authenticity is so important, isn't it? No one's going to, someone used a great expression the other day, is a leader who is going on a journey by themselves is having a walk. A leader who is going on a journey and people following him is doing a proper leadership job. And that comes from civility and authenticity, doesn't it? That people believe and trust in you're the person that they can lead and follow in that element. So you've talked about behaviours as well, Hal. I mean, are your behaviours that you expect in the organisation written down? I mean, are they kind of patrolled? I mean, you talked about what's acceptable and what's not. So is that something you just all know and you've developed, or is it more tangible than that?
I wish it was very tangible, and I wish I could really put my finger on some of it. Yes, absolutely. Like lots of organisations, we do have policies about acceptable behaviour, if you'd like. We also so recently we've developed a very strong anti-racism strategy, for example. So there are bits of that which are kind of written down, if you'd like. I think there is a bit about the kind of on paper versus the enacting of it, and some bits of that are, as is still the case, there absolutely have been some areas where, individual behaviour wasn't as it should be, that's been grumbling on forever. It's only at the point where actually you kind of take on some of those difficult challenges, and people can see that we're not going to accept those behaviours and something will happen about it, that I think people really believe in some of it. And don't get me wrong, there's lots still that we've got to sort out, so I'm not pretending everything's perfect, but I think if in any big organisation there will be people who aren't behaving as they should, and whether that's kind of bullying behaviour or whether it's misogynistic behaviour or racist behaviour, that it'll people will talk about it and it's a bit under the radar, but it's people aren't, if we're not willing to kind of stand up and address those difficult things, we'll kind of never get anywhere, and it's not quick and it's not easy. And on a couple of occasions it's ended up with employment tribunals, but I think you kind of have to do it, would be my feeling. That sounds like I'm really hard and kind of looking out for fights and things, and I don't mean it like that, but I think as leaders, if we don't address what's in front of our eyes that isn't good, we'll never have any credibility, and people keep on behaving in the bad ways. So it's that sort of balance between taking action when we should in a fair and just way, but also recognizing, when things are good, then we're kind of encouraging, if you like, the silent majority who are doing, good day-to-day job, and then picking out where things aren't right. I kind of imagine it must be like that in all organisations. Although I have, as I mentioned at the beginning, I've been here for 20 years, so I've got a slightly blinkered view, and maybe Chesterfield's kind of a bad outlier from that point of view, but.
Yeah, and interestingly, to me, that sounds a confident leadership team and a consistent leadership team, because the worst of all worlds, isn't it, is is A, you deal with those things badly, but B, they're ignored, and therefore you essentially, as an organization, as a leadership team, you condone it, don't you? You're saying this is okay, this is all right to continue. And we know that breeds all types of even worse behavior, because everybody looks at it and says, well, you knew about it, but you did nothing about it, did you? So I mean, there's nothing draconian or tough about that. It's absolutely the consistent leadership role, isn't it? And it sounds like as a team you've grappled with that hard and and come through how to do it.
And I think it's really important that that is done as a team as well, because partly you're all in it together, and then you can have a shared view about it. But it's also partly from an organisation point of view, it's a much stronger message if all of your exec team, for the sake of argument, are all saying the same thing, and they're all addressing the behaviours when they arise. It works much more powerfully than if it's just one person doing it. And I mean, I think if anything works well at all in Chesterfield, it's because actually I think I'm working as part of a really good team who have very shared values, but are all doing a really good job. And I think it's that, in a way, maybe a chief exec has to be a kind of conductor rather than, but it's all but the music comes from the orchestra, doesn't it? And it's really the team is the orchestra who are actually producing the results in a way, aren't they?
Yeah, and it's lots of strains and stresses in every role, but you are there to support others to thrive, don't they? And get great talent to be brilliant. And I regularly say that I've got far more talented people across the organisation than I have ever been, and that's brilliant, because I wouldn't be able to do my job without them, really. So, but that's interesting. Let's turn that into where you were going then about your role, because you've been there, as you say, a good while. It's quite hard, I think, coming from someone in the organization and then leading it, because you've been medical director, and you've obviously had other leadership roles since then. What do you think your personal impact on the organization is? And I'm intrigued about you as a clinical leader as much as a just a CEO. How do you bring all that into the leadership role that you do, Hal?
That's I mean, it's difficult.
I'm asking you to talk about yourself now. So
yeah,
just for those listening, I can see Hal squirming on camera, kind of thinking, I want to talk about myself.
Well, luckily it's just audio, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
So I mean, I think that there's both pluses and downsides to being a clinical leader in the chief exec role. So the downside is that you're always a bit open to criticism from outsiders, that your focus is just on the clinical care, and you don't really get the finance, and you don't really get the personnel side of things, and you're focusing exclusively on that. And I think in practice that's perhaps a bit unfair, because in the end, we can all learn different skills, can't we? I think the advantage of being so there's a little anecdote. So I did my clinic yesterday, and I saw an elderly lady, and she came with her daughter, and the daughter was one of our health cares. And I had the consultation with her mother, and the healthcare was sort of kind of half proudly saying to her mother, "Oh, this is my boss," kind of thing. And I'm saying, "Well, I'm not your boss today. I'm just being a gastroenterology consultant today," and that's fine. And at the end of the consultation, we sort of agreed to plan for the mother that people were all happy with, and the healthcare got up and gave me a hug at the end of it and said, I think you're doing a great job as our chief executive. Now, I've kind of got an inbuilt advantage there compared to an average chief exec, because I suspect that healthcare will go back onto her ward and will tell her colleagues on the ward about, she saw me, but I was, hopefully, good, competent doctor, and I was really nice to her mum, and all of the rest of it, in a way that is going to be more of a struggle if you're, you've been a finance director and you become the chief exec. So in some ways, there's a real advantage to that. And when things are difficult and we're making difficult decisions, it's really difficult for people to level an accusation at me that, you don't know what it's like, you've not got to deal with patients. So I think there is a real advantage to that. And I'd always encourage more clinicians to, be involved in management, because actually I think it's a really worthwhile role. And, we can do, great things sometimes as a clinician with that patient in front of us, but sometimes as a manager, we can do something for, the 100,000 patients that come to ED each year, or the 400,000 people in our catchment area who might need to use our hospital. So I think sometimes we're not good enough at encouraging clinicians to get involved and to take a role, and because I think you can do really good things, but because you're starting from a really credible position in that perspective from the workforce point of view.
Yeah, you're very much aligned and knowledgeable at that aspect, and certain people coming in to learn about what even happens in healthcare. It's a tough it's a tough learning curve, isn't it, to really understand that, and you've lived and breathed that. So what did though allowed you to kind of 5 years ago move into that executive space? How did that happen? What informed you and allowed you to move into that and then become the chief exec 2 or 3 years later? What I'm intrigued in that kind of little journey on that respect.
I mean, like lots of there's chance in luck, and so I think consultants are involved in leadership and management of people all the time, because you have your your clinical team that's working with you, and you're engaging with people, and obviously you'll be involved in service developments and so on. So it's not something that's alien to lots of, and that would be the same if you were a senior nurse, or it would be the same if you were managing a physiotherapy team or something. I did, for what it's worth, I was having a bit of a midlife crisis, I suppose, 10 years ago, and thinking, well, I've been a consultant for 10 years, and am I just carrying on doing exactly the same thing for the next 10 years? And I had a very a senior consultant colleague who'd previously been a medical director, who I used to chat to, and who was a very supportive kind of mentor, and said, well, maybe you should get involved in this a bit more. And that sort of led into kind of medical management positions, which in turn, and this is where opportunity sometimes happens, isn't it? So 5 years ago, our medical director was standing down, and it was probably a bit earlier than I would have been thinking I would have been applying for that role. But because of the nature of it, if you don't apply, then it probably wasn't going to be available for the next 4 or 5 years. So it's a kind of now or never type thing. And then a couple of years ago, our chief exec at the time was sort of retiring a bit unexpectedly. So the hospital was looking for someone who was kind of, I suppose, well respected in the organisation, could hold the fort for a bit. But then it's one of those things that, having done it for a while, it was, it was a real challenge, and it was stimulating and interesting. And so then I wanted to do it. I still, to some extent, think that the medical director job that I did before was the best job I did, because there's some bits of being a chief exec at the moment that it's just so kind of difficult and miserable with some of the financial and operational planning challenges, and the kind of slightly odd way that that's managed centrally, if I can put that diplomatically.
Well, I think that's a reasonable way to describe it. I'm sure off recording we could describe it many different ways, couldn't we? But yeah.
So in a way that it is a very complex, difficult job being a chief executive, and I think maybe it's just because I'm relatively new to it, or maybe it's particularly difficult at the moment. But I think you are trying to balance so many conflicting challenges and priorities, and it is difficult at times. And I think without a good team around you, it would be very difficult to keep going. And I think we're all human as well as leaders, and we need positive feedback sometimes as well, don't we? And because that helps keep us going as well, doesn't it? And so there's we're doing this out of a sort of duty and wanting to do the right thing, and I think that has to be very strong underneath it all. But at times when it's difficult, we all need a bit of a boost sometimes, don't we?
Yeah. And you talked about your real reliance on your team, and have developed the team and sustained the team. What sustains and motivates you to keep going then outside of that team? Because you've talked about all those pressures. You've talked about the frankly bizarre things that happen at times that you just have to deal with, as well as running organizations, keeping a great culture. So what keeps Hal going and coming in every day and facing all these things?
It has to be at the end the feeling that you're making a difference. You are doing something worthwhile, and you are making a difference to our patients, and that they are being, things aren't perfect, are they? And there's challenges, and there's lots that we would like to do better, but that within the resource that we've got, that we're providing a good service to our patients, and that's I think that's really important. I think variety is important. So you've got your team within your hospital, but you've also got the team perhaps within your colleagues within the system that you might be working with are very important and supportive. I think for all of us it's really important that we do other things as well. And so I'm really kind of strict with myself. When I'm on holiday, I'm on holiday. I have got a really good, competent team. I can rely on them to look after things when I'm away. It's important that you have that switching, whatever interest it is that you have on holiday, you need to be switching off and not looking at your emails every day when you're away and things. I think that's not sustainable long term, or at least it wouldn't be for me. I'd be worn out and leave. But I think sometimes we try and do too much, and we try and take too much responsibility on, when it is, bottom line is, if I'm run over by a bus tomorrow, Chesterfield Hospital's not going to collapse in a heap. It's still going to continue as an organisation. I hope some people will be sad, but it's not going to. It's still going to go on, and sometimes we need to remember that as well. We're part of, a great organisation in the NHS, and we're an important part of it, but we're a small part of it as well.
Yeah. And one of my colleagues reminded me when you're talking about holidays that people need a break from us as well. It's not just that we've got a break from them. It's quite nice. So please don't email me when you're on holiday, because actually that's not very helpful, which is always a good reminder for us leaders. Yeah, the world does not revolve around us in that respect.
Yeah, completely.
And then just as a final thought, Hal, what are you looking forward to? You've talked about, you said there's variety, making a difference. You want to switch off, but what when you sit there and yes, things are tough, and we're getting through the current planning into 24, 25, and yes, there'll be a general election, yabba dabba dabba. But what are you looking forward to over the kind of next year or 2 years in your leadership role, and what does that look like?
I think for me, in the end, and this is a bit about making a difference, I think a couple of years from now, I'd like, you'll never have everyone thinking this, but I'd like the vast majority of the people who work in our organisation to think, A, it's a good place to work, and B, that actually we're kind of doing an outstanding job for our patients. And I mean that in the sense that my kind of staff colleagues think that, not that CQC think it. It'd be lovely if CQC came along and said we're outstanding as well. I've no problem with that. But my motivation behind it is people I work with being really proud of the good care that they're able to give, despite the challenges and despite financial constraints and so on, that actually they're proud that they're doing a good job, and that they kind of feel able to do a good job. I think that would be my that's what I'd like in a couple of years.
That's a great place to end, isn't it? Because Hal, you've talked about what really shines through is and your two objectives. You've got really two objectives: that Chesterfield Royal is a great place to work and your staff are happy, for the care that you provide in hospital, and that's the thing that motivates you. And it's been fascinating to hear how you've done that, how you do that as a clinical leader, the internal improvement academy, the really important civility saves lives type of approach, and really openness, and that whole element of listening, responding, being consistent. You said to me as we were chatting before we started recording, I'm not sure how we do this. I can understand how you do this, because all of those are tangible, real things that I'm sure your staff feel on a day-to-day basis. And it's been an absolute honour to listen to a little insight into the world of Chesterfield Royal and your leadership team. And thank you for sharing your experiences with us all on this podcast.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm sure that's much kinder than I deserve, but thank you very much for your time and for doing this, because I think I think it's very interesting to hear from others about, what we can all do well and what we can all do better.
Thank you, Hal.
Thank you.